Welcome to today's podcast. In this podcast, we challenge ideas, dissect ideologies, and rethink the narratives shaping our world. Our guest today is a scholar who has sparked global debates on democracy, liberalism, and the very foundations of global political order. Professor Patrick Deneen, author of the groundbreaking Why Liberalism Failed and the Regime Change, is not just a political theorist, he is a provocateur of thought, questioning the very system that many take for granted. Get ready for a conversation that will challenge convention, shake assumptions, and push the boundaries of modern political discourse. Professor Patrick Deneen, it's such an honor to have you on my show.
Thanks very much. I'm glad to be here with you.
Wonderful. Well, let's get straight into it, shall we? Now, in your book, Why Liberalism Failed, you didn't use an open question as to whether or not, for example, has liberalism failed, but you implied the conclusion in there that it has failed. But now let's go on to the actual finding, the reasons why it failed. Now that part is fine, and you are very much clear on that. And within your book and your podcasts and other lectures, there's a clear message that the liberalism failed because it succeeded. The question is that it failed because it succeeded because it was always, by design and by default, it was always meant to meet its failure? Or did you mean that it got corrupted along the way, and the newer version of it, that was so full of contradictions or some other problems that because it succeeded, therefore it failed?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer at some level because it would require godlike knowledge of all of the cause and effects of all things. I'll just say as follows: that the thesis of the book and what I've continued to maintain is that there are very strong tendencies within the liberal ideology that lead to its internal contradiction over time. This is not to say that this is necessarily inevitable. A lot of things had to happen along the way, which were contingent and perhaps not inevitable. But when those things happen, it happens within the context of strong underlying tendencies. Economic developments, globalization may not have happened in the way that it happened, but there are strong tendencies within a sort of neoliberal economic order that lead to various forms of globalization that have led to various economic internal crises, domestic as well as international crises. So I suppose I would just say that I think one can be unsurprised at developments that have led to the crisis of modern liberalism without sacrificing the idea that at some level as human beings, we are free. We actually have the ability to make choices and we can evaluate among other things, the system under which we're being governed.
I suppose it's another way of looking at it is that given the fact that the natural habitat of human beings or a type of habitat in which humans can really flourish is not based on individualism. It actually is based on community building and coexisting and helping each other. Many of our innate dispositions, such as helping other people, even if that costs us, the altruistic behavior and so forth, I mean, they are built in to tell us that we have to work together. Um, it seems strange that on one side, as you quite rightly mentioned, that there is an illusion of freedom. But on the other hand, if we look at some of the byproducts of liberalism, they don't seem to give the real freedom. For example, if you look at the consumerism, which is part of the liberal economy, and within the idea of consumerism, what we do is have a collective sense of fashion, for example, or attire, for example, or hairstyle, and everybody must conform to it, or they will be outcasts. And if they don't feel free enough to depart from that, so we do have role models, actors, and celebrities, and they are projected as people that everyone has to follow. And if everyone has to follow and everyone has to conform, I mean, it doesn't quite sound like liberal. So it looks like an illusion of liberalism where people are controlled collectively through consumerism, which is a very, very much paradoxical situation, isn't it?
Yeah, I would even argue it goes deeper than that. I think, of course, you're right that
in a way, a kind of conformity. Um, a kind of conformity is always a default for human beings. We tend to take our cues by comparisons to those around us. And this is always going to cause a certain amount of, a certain amount of dissonance with those who believe that they're free. So there'll always be some people who exemplify their independence and their freedom by dressing or acting or behaving in ways that show that they're contrarians. I think that's true in every society, whether it's liberal or not. I think every society has the kind of contrarian mentality and the more conformist mentality. And that's simply true, whether it's a liberal society or not. But what I think is the deeper form of the way in which liberalism, in a way, ironically, and maybe in an almost paradoxical way, creates a condition of unfreedom, is that by rendering every aspect of our lives into the subject of our own choice, it actually ends up hollowing out and undermining those parts of life that are not necessarily ideally conformed to or organized around the principle of the free, sovereign individual chooser. So, I mean, the one example, of course, would be family life. Liberalism has a very difficult time uh, addressing and, in some ways, um, reconciling itself to the reality that as human beings, we're born to parents we don't choose as children. Parents have children that they don't choose. And so, what's the status of families within a liberal order? And of course, i- human beings, almost you could say, as a matter of nature, understand that we exist in these conditions in which we are simply brought into the world, not in the form or the imaginings of the liberal individual, but as creatures who are bundles of obligations and duties and gratitude. You know, things that we don't, in a sense, choose, but are required of us as a matter of duty. And so the liberal order will want to turn every aspect of life into a kind of ultimately kind of consumer choice. And this is where we begin to see developments in our world, where of course through reproductive technology, we increasingly exercise a choice over whether we have children or whether we don't have children. And of course, people now can do tests and find out if the gender of the child, the sex of the child is what they want, and exercise choice in that domain. And we're certainly seeing uh, increasing signs that we're going to be able to create designer babies. And so notice how that aspect of our lives that is fundamentally oriented to teaching us a kind of a way of relating to other human beings from a standpoint of love and duty and obligation and gratitude is undermined by turning it into a fundamentally a consumer mindset, which of course that's the opposite of developing the capacities of gratitude and obligation and duty. It's really a kind of self-serving ideal that in which if I don't like the situation I'm in, I choose otherwise. I act as a consumer. So it shapes an entire worldview, and in a sense, we don't have a choice about whether we accept that worldview. Uh, One has to be extremely well formed in a way, and to be formed in a way contrary to liberal assumptions, not to be shaped by those predominant consumerist worldviews.
Incidentally, if someone has been able to do that, that would go back to the classical sense of liberalism, where one has freed him or herself from all the desires and the rat race, and in biblical sense that you quite often allude to as well, that um,
Yeah, I
people
do think
have.
it requires some kind of connection to a kind of pre-liberal understanding, and that's typically through a religious tradition. So the biblical tradition certainly being one of those.
Certainly. Now, uh, true aspects of liberalism we have discussed. Now, when you say that liberalism, or why liberalism has failed, clearly implying that it certainly has. But if we look at the actual scheme of liberalism in a broader sense, now we have the political liberalism that comes in form of liberal democracy, and the cultural liberalism in form of individualism. And we also have the economic liberalism in the form of capitalism, or now the neo-capitalism. When you say it has failed, do you mean all three aspects have failed, or is there any one or maybe two you are referring to?
Well, it's interesting. So the three that you named were political, so liberal democracy, uh, cultural, which I think we've been discussing in some ways, and economic. And if you think about what's been happening in the Western world and the political shift, the actual sort of what we can see and empirically discern, and the panic that it's caused among the kind of ruling class and the liberal elite in Western liberal democracies broadly, I think you can say that we see a failure in all of these fronts. That politically, the sort of advance of the liberal ideal and the liberal hegemony has been stopped. Has been stopped politically by democracy. And so, what one typically hears in liberal, so-called liberal democracies, is that when an outcome and when a democratic outcome runs contrary to liberal expectations, we're told that this is a threat to democracy. So you have the paradoxical or contradictory condition in which democracy is is contradicting democracy, which I think is just a sleight of hand. And what it's really revealing is that democracy is thwarting liberalism. So, what liberal democracies or what liberal elite attempts to do is to define democratic outcomes as something other than democratic, as populist or as fascist or authoritarian, uh, um, thereby attempting to maintain the mantle of legitimacy of democracy, even as they're rejecting it. And I think we see that all over the world. The efforts to dismiss all of these various elections that have resulted in an uprising. So we see politically that liberalism is in a very bad place because it is attempting to claim a legitimacy that it, in fact, does not have right now. We certainly see economically that, again, that the demos has widely rejected the ongoing advance of the globalized neoliberal economic order, demanding the cessation of a kind of borderless world, demanding the reinstitution of borders in a real sense, which preventing or let's say monitoring and metering entry of foreign peoples into the nation, but also demanding the strengthening of national economies and seeing that economies uh, function for the benefit of the people in that nation and not merely for the benefit of those who are going to make the most money off of a globalized system. So a demand that the economies serve the citizenry of the nation, and also that it uh, contribute to the security and order of the nation. So we see a cessation of neoliberal economics, and lastly, the cultural matter. I think it's connected to both of these. That the insecurity and disorder that has arisen from a kind of globalized neoliberal order in both economic sense, but also, as we were discussing, the belief that there is no such thing as a man or a woman, the claim that there's, all of our identities are fundamentally liquid and fungible. Well, there's been a solid and sort of deeply exclamatory rejection of that view, certainly in the last election in the United States. So I think it's quite clear that, and the argument of my book, Why Liberalism Failed, was really to see and understand that all of these features, the economic, the political, the cultural, educational, things we think of as personal or private, these are all fundamentally interconnected. And there's no way of just simply taking a strand out and saying you can have good political liberalism if you get rid of bad economic liberalism, or you can have good economic liberalism if you get rid of bad cultural liberalism. And I think the underlying argument is fundamentally Aristotelian, that a regime shapes all aspects of life, and it does so in a way that's pervasive, comprehensive, and becomes almost indiscernible, becomes impossible to see because it's the water that you're swimming in, and so you don't, like a fish, you don't see the water that you swim in. So I think it's quite clear that the crisis of liberalism is pretty comprehensive because of that, because of the nature of a liberal regime shaping all aspects of life.
That's very true. And I suppose the highlight of the conversation so far is that quite rightly you mentioned that when democracy yields results that are not quite pro-liberal, then all of a sudden democracy itself hits crisis so far as the liberal views are concerned. So I suppose what liberals essentially are saying that you can choose any color so long as it's black. So you can choose, you can make any political choice so long as it supports liberalism. So I mean that is something I think with the liberal political philosophers, it gives them a lot to think about. But at a much deeper level, um, the question I'm about to ask is it's difficult for me to form because it is going to include certain assumptions that some of them are historical facts, but some of the assumptions I'm going to make are going to be about future. So I may be right, I may be wrong on that, but I'm going to put it to you anyway. That we know that historically speaking, the early part of the first century, for example, Marxism came to power. It came up with a lot of promises, then it failed. And that failure gave rise to fascism. And Herbert Marcuse and a number of other political philosophers, they had a great deal of commentary about it. Um, Now, that's what we have seen in history. If liberal hegemony is now to collapse and a new vacuum, which is to inevitably emerge, are we going to see something similar to fascism, given the fact that there are some similarities? I mean, strong individuals, the Mussolinis and Hitlers and those number of other people, in Far East as well. I mean, very, very strong individuals. And now we see in Europe, in the West, for not just Europe, in the Western world, we've started to see some very strong individuals in the form of Donald Trump, for example, or Elon Musk, or Le Pen in France. Do you see some correlation between the historical events that transpired many decades ago and something which can probably happen, maybe not in form of full fascism, but something close to it?
Mhm. Well, I think it's the way you characterize the rise of fascism. I would dispute at least at one level, which is that fascism didn't arise, I don't think, specifically because of the failure of communism. It did arise in part because of the existence of communism and the fear that communism might succeed. I mean, certainly in Germany, where communism is one of the offerings from the left that is threatening the social democracy of the Weimar Republic, and fascism was in many ways a response to that. Of course, communism outlives fascism in the form of the Soviet Union. So, fascism didn't arise necessarily out of the failures of communism. That we're still seeing what's arising out of the failures of communism, of course, in the former Soviet Union. But I think the basic point is worth discussing, which is that fascism when it has arisen, it's tended to arise as a response to the felt threat of communism, and so the assertion of strong national identity, which we're certainly seeing in parts of the Western world, the rejection of communism as a not just an economic system, but as an organizing principle of society, is was one of those aspects. And I would say that there is a modified form of a kind of right wing nationalism that is very much a possibility arising from the failure of liberalism, just as there's efforts afoot to advance communism. I think all of these, what we regard as the defeated ideologies of the 20th century, remain in modified form as political possibilities in our future. Uh, this is not to say that history is merely repeating itself, because I don't think that's the case. But there's there is a kind of pendulum, a political pendulum that can swing to the extreme far left and it can swing to the extreme far right. And my own view is that the swing of this pendulum to the far left or the far right would be a terrible mistake. But it's also my view, contrary to many of friends that I have and many colleagues that I have, it's also my view that the way of preventing the swing of the pendulum to the very far left or the very far right is not the effort to rebuild a liberal democracy in the ways in which we've been discussing, because I think the pendulum swinging to the far left and the far right is occurring because of the failures of liberal democracy. So the real question that we have is what follows the collapse of the trajectory of liberal democracy in the West that doesn't fall into political pathologies on the right or the left. And here I think that the great traditions of the West that we can still have strong understanding and connections to that do derive from the broadly Greek Christian tradition of the European long centuries European tradition could be and stand as a potential bulwark against these developments that have always stood as a bulwark against these developments. But this is not to dismiss the possibility we are in a time of real political hazard. I wouldn't deny that at all, and that I recognize that we are in a time of political upheaval.
Certainly, and I think one thing which is certain that, well, nothing is certain with way the developments are happening, and I think U.S. is now much more settled as to what people wanted. They've been very clear in last three elections, I think, but the continent Europe is going through a lot of changes, and it isn't
There's no doubt.
really it is settled. So I think
Yeah,
there's a lot.
no doubt.
Okay,
Yeah.
there is
And here again, I think Europe is in danger of being nostalgic about a temporary period of time. The order in which the nations of Europe would be essentially a protectorate of the United States, that was always going to come to an end. And the belief that somehow that could continue indefinitely, and that's what we should desire to go back to, well, I think that's also coming to an end. And so Europe has some very difficult and challenging decisions to make about itself, but it will mean it will have to become political. The nations of Europe will have to become, in that very classical sense, they will have to re-engage the world of politics, which is a world of reality. And they've been living, I think, in a kind of 50-year, 75-year hiatus from politics. That seems odd to say, but I think it's going to be a difficult re-entry into the world of hard, difficult, but nevertheless necessary political decision making.
Now, I think that's true, particularly when, as we know, that the fault lines exist in all sort of cohabitations, partnerships, friendships, even in families. So there have been some fault lines in rather interesting relationship between Europe and the US. I mean, if you look at the Atlantic Accords, for example, Europeans feel that the US actually did. We were done hard done by some of the terms there, and US itself feels that, look, we jumped into the war and we have to rebuild, and I think billions of dollars were given to Europe at that time. But from there onwards, the tendencies of Europe to Russia, now the Europeans would feel that now we are at that stage because the US, being the leader of the liberal world under the arrangements such as the Bretton Woods system, and now we have communism on our doorstep, which collapsed in 1991. But before that, yes, we fought that war under the US, and the US was the main beneficiary of that because leader will always take the lion's share. And US was feeling that, well, we are doing a lot for Europe. I mean, you're well away from all those problems. But because there was economic prosperity and there was a shared liberal value system across the board, so maybe those differences didn't materialize to any meaningful extent. But now if we look at the departure from Europe to US, by the way, add one more the thing to it. Europeans also believe that because the way in which our financial systems are intertwined, if the US sneezes, we catch the bug. And they keep on referring to the 2008 recession, that it was not Europe's fault at all. It was all done in the US, that we just caught the virus and then we also fell sick and so on and so forth. And US making decisions without taking Europe into account, be it blowing up the Nord Stream, that is, if that is true, but for all accounts, it does seem to be true, which means that our gas is now becoming more expensive. US is fine with it. So those things were not really part of any public discourse before, but now they are becoming more and more. Do you see this drift growing further?
Yeah, I think the what you describe as a drift is it's been in place for quite a few years. Um, so yeah, I mean, you portrayed, I think, from the perspective certainly of Europe, you portrayed the U.S. as a kind of bit of a bully, dictating terms, making decisions, breaking things. The bull in the china shop, and Europe would sort of suffer the consequences. But of course, there's the flip side to that, which is the U.S. would take on many of the burdens of policing the world, of enforcing conditions of peace, of securing the seaways, of uh, providing a security shield over Europe. And Europe, as a result, did not have to, in some ways, take seriously the military threat that existed all over the world, the demands that global peace uh, required of the U.S. military, of the U.S. taxpayer, and this situation. So, I mean, what you really had was a kind of unhealthy, a kind of unhealthy relationship, almost a comparable way in which a couple can have an unhealthy relationship when one partner is domineering, and the other partner is supposed to be supine and accepting, and that tends not to work out all that well. So the so I think what we're really seeing is Europe is a great civilization, and Europe should rightly assume its position as a great civilization in the world. And some of the nations of Europe are going to have to step up more. I think we're going to see Germany and France having to step up more. It's going to be very interesting, of course, to see how the ongoing relationship between those two nations develops, and the place, and of course the three great nations of Europe have typically been France, Germany, and Europe, and England, and Great Britain, and what the future relationship of those will be in relationship to the United States. So I really think that what we're seeing is a kind of the emergence from a 50-year, 75-year kind of artificial forced marriage, if you will, that is coming to its natural end. And I don't think this means that it will be a hostile, uh, that the breakup may be troubled. I think we're seeing a troubled breakup right now, but it does not mean that the result will be a hostile relationship. In fact, I think it will be a better relationship over a longer term, where Europe can assert some of its independence. I think it will have the following consequences. Europe has, of course, will have to assume more responsibility for its security. When you assume more responsibility for your security, you have to develop a kind of strong sense of what you are, not just what you're against, but what you are and what you stand for. And I think Europe has been very listless, and has lost self confidence about what it is, and a kind of pride of what it is, what Europe has meant in the history of the world, and what it has yet to offer in the future of the world. It also means, I think, it will be a strengthening of the European economies, which have been themselves listless. And they can blame the United States for the 2008 economic crisis, but the European economies have been, they have not seen the kind of outburst of creativity, inventiveness, entrepreneurial spirit that certainly has been the hallmark of the American economy over the last 75 years. And I think until that is, in a sense, unleashed by the reentry into the real world, and departing from this kind of artificially embraced and enforced yeah, um, relationship with the United States, Europe will not step up to what its great potential is. So I'm actually fairly positive about this development, not because I think, and certainly not because I hope that there will be hostility or conflict between the United States and Europe, but I think they should be on terms that are far more equal than they have been in the last, almost century.
I certainly agree with that. Now, let's shift back from the intra-West relationship to the liberalism, which is the discussion across the board in the entire part of entire Western world. Um, Pat Buchanan, in his book "Death of the West," he he presents an idea that one of the reasons, I mean, what he believes the death of the West is caused primarily by the socialist element within the West. So he didn't expressly mention that, but if you go through the rest of the book, the meaning, and I may have misunderstood that, but my reading of that is that what he believes is that classical liberalism was one thing, but the infusion of, or the transfer rather, from classical liberalism to the progressive liberalism, which is kind of euphemism for left taking over liberalism or hijacking it, and then coming up with the ideas of egalitarianism and sharing all the resources and the borderless world that you were referring to earlier, which means that the responsibility, the individual responsibility, came less and less, and the result of that was, and the self-indulgence became so much that people didn't have to take responsibility for kids. They could simply have, for example, sexual relationships without women getting pregnant, for example. I mean, these are pretty close to what he is. This is not verbatim, but pretty close to what he was saying. And that led the decline. So you can see the structure there. So you have the individualism, and people don't have to take responsibilities. If they don't have to take responsibilities, they are not going to have kids. When they're not going to have kids, that will cause the population decline. And with the population decline, everything else declines, all the services, everything else, economy, and you name it. So he is directly taking aim at left socialism and its infusion into liberalism. And that is the reason that the West, in his word, is dying. Do you subscribe to that idea?
Yeah, of course, this has been a dominant narrative on what's typically called the conservative or right, now increasingly called the right liberal position, or the classical liberal position, which is that progressive liberalism, so it's sort of more socialist form, what develops certainly across Europe, and even what develops in the United States in the early and middle part of the 20th century and becomes dominantly seen as progressivism in the United States. The argument among those on the classical liberal right is that this development represents a departure from, and a kind of almost a, a virus that enters what was previously a healthy host. So the thesis is that we just have to simply kill the virus and go back to the healthy liberalism, the classical liberalism that preexisted the introduction of this virus. My own view is that, in fact, this is less a sort of a viral infection than it is a development from within the sort of the body of liberalism itself, that it is a kind of a inborn tendency within liberalism to develop its progressive form. That, in fact, the progressive liberal viewpoint fundamentally resembles, in terms of its ambition and what it envisions, it is fundamentally similar to, if not almost identical with, classical liberalism. That classical liberalism holds the vision of the liberated individual, who is the sovereign chooser, going back to what we were talking about, the consumer. The sovereign choosing individual is in some ways the aim of the classical liberal political, social, economic order. Where progressive liberalism ends up disagreeing with classical liberalism is what it takes to achieve the condition of the sovereign individual. And in the progressive view, it disputes the idea that we can begin by assuming that human beings are by nature individual. Right? So it disputes the idea that you find in the state of nature philosophy of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, for example. It disputes the idea that if we are left free of any external imposition, that our natural freedom as individuals and our natural selves as individuals will emerge from this condition of radical freedom. What the progressive viewpoint is that individuals are made and not born. And individuals are made particularly through the efforts and support of the state, and particularly efforts of the state to create conditions of equal freedom. So equality is not really the end, although it's certainly one of its main means, but the equality becomes the means to the liberation of the individual. So, I mean, if you look at progressivism, what it really is pushing forward, it's not simply equality, it's radical freedom at the end of equality, right? What is the great project of progressivism today? It's sexual liberation. It's the liberation of our bodies from all limitations, so that the aim and ambition is the complete liberation of the individual. And the means change because, of course, we're not born equal. There are men, there are women, there are people born in poor circumstances and wealthy circumstances. There are people who are treated differently because of their race. And so once the condition of equal liberty is achieved, then we are all genuinely equally free. It's a kind of, again, it's a very Rousseauian vision that stands as the kind of corrective to the Lockean belief that we're born free in the state of nature. So dispute really ultimately is over means and not ends. And this is why it has not mattered whether classical liberals or progressive liberals have been in charge of the American political system, because they advance the same end. They simply differ over the means, whether it's economic libertarianism or social libertarianism. So in my view, there's no going back to some pristine liberalism, because the conditions arise as a kind of matter of logic from the basic premises.
That's fair enough. And I suppose the sudden shifts in the society, I mean, they can produce results like this. I mean, for example, from the verificationist idea of Vienna Circle of 1920s. And again, I don't mean that those ideas were similarly accepted across the West, but it was certainly a time when people were bound to scientific ideas in an unprecedented manner. Whatever science says, you have to accept that, and anything which is not verified by science, or you don't take that. And from there to the postmodernism, and the shift from this radical and drastic shift and sudden shift, it can't be just a coincidence that we had the rise of the postmodernism and the rise of sexual revolution. I mean, they almost coincide. So all of a sudden, when it becomes that, well, like you said, my body, my liberation, my sexual liberation, and the contraceptives. I mean, those sort of medicines or any type of pregnancy prevention medicines widely available to people, then yeah, that type of freedom that may have existed in minds, it just became real all of a sudden, and then why not? Uh, Before I go to to the next question, there's one thing.
Yeah, if I might just
Please.
build on what you were just saying, it is striking the way in which, if you look at the development of, a Marxist leftism, certainly as it becomes embraced within the Western liberal order, it actually abandons the kind of class basis that had, of course, been the part of the central aspect of Marxist analysis. And it instead embraces and advances an idea of individual liberation. And you mentioned previously the name of Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse doesn't become the great advocate of class warfare. He becomes the great advocate of what we now see as the kind of liberation of the individual, technologically assisted to do what they want. And this, of course, centrally involves sexual liberation. So his work on Eros and civilization, his reliance upon Freudianism, that our genuine liberation at the end of history is not because of a class revolution, it's a kind of sexual revolution. And this is echoed by the really significant feminist thinker Shulamith Firestone in her work, The Dialectic of Sex, which she opens by arguing that genuine Marxism will not be achieved until the difference between men and women is technologically erased. And so, where do we find kind of progressivism today? It is advancing a kind of vision of a technologically equalized society in which sexual differences are erased, and our bodies are become completely the subject of our own sovereign will. And again, if you think about the way in which that vision ultimately ends up lining up with a certain understanding of the human being as a radically free individual that's already posited in the state of nature theories going back, to the 16th, 17th century. It's just amazing how what are supposedly the two parties of liberalism end up becoming fundamentally indistinguishable.
Something just came to my mind that um, I always pondered over um, sort of an open-ended kind of weird paradoxical position of Karl Marx of synthesis. So you have the thesis and antithesis and finally synthesis. I always used to think if that is the case, then why Marxism? Why does it have to be the final position? Well, any rendition of it, be it socialism or communism, because if this theory is true, then it must synthesize with something else. And what you just mentioned, I never thought about it this way before. So maybe the synthesis was to Marxism to uh, depart from some of its core demands and fuse within the liberalism, and and the result of that is what we've seen in the last 40, 50 years in Europe. Yeah, maybe Marx was right in a way, but not in the way that he thought he would be. So yeah, there is a synthesis of Marxism into something new. Um, okay, now moving on, we've seen postmodernism, and now some academics believe that as from 2011, 2012, we are in the era of postmodernism, in which religion is now becoming part of the public policy again, and certainly we can see a lot of that manifested in the U.S. elections. There's a very strong religious sentiment there manifested. Same goes in in Europe as well, because somehow right wing is typically associated with religiously minded people. So we look at Italy, for example, or look at Hungary, Austria. Those governments, they are certainly not, typically speaking, the liberal elite government, so to speak. Um, but if liberalism is to go away and there's a lot of shift that is to take place, what do you think the new type of government that can come into power? Because the reason I ask this question, if I may explain, it's going to take 30 seconds. That it's very difficult to believe that people will suddenly depart from the cultural liberalism and they would go back to what classic liberalism or classic liberals did, for example, getting married and forming the society on the fundamental blocks of family, or treating family as the micro civilization and then connect all the families together and create a macro civilization. I don't, the youth we see in the West, it doesn't feel like they have the appetite of going to that type of life. So if that can't happen, liberalism can't survive, then what is the middle way you see in the immediate future?
Yeah. Well, this is why I and among others, a number of others have adopted the language or phrase of post-liberalism, which is it's an old descriptor, and number of people describe it differently. But I think what the descriptor is identifying is that what I envision and hope for, and what I think is likely to happen, is that we are going to live in a time after liberalism. In other words, there will not be a going back. There's not going to be the reconstitution of some particular form of social, political, economic order that pre-existed liberalism. So, in the fantasies of some classical liberals, America will go back to 1789. It will go back to the time of the founding of the Constitution. That's not going to happen. In the view of others, very conservative Catholic types, we're going to go back to the Middle Ages and have a Catholic monarchy govern Europe. I don't foresee that happening. Rather, what we are going to see is a time after liberalism, in other words, in which we have gone through a liberal order. It will not be, all of its particulars will not be abandoned in just the way that the liberal order did not abandon all the particulars of a Christian order. Those remained in robust form for a very long period of time. So a post-liberal world will be one, for example, in which certainly in the Western liberal order, the equality of men and women is not going to be dismissed as a, sort of a momentary blip. I just don't, I don't think that's going to happen, and I don't particularly desire that that's going to happen. What I do think is going to happen, and here maybe I'll push back a little bit against something you just said. I think you're correct that young people show little apparent appetite for living more traditional lives. But this is because that path has been really substantially forestalled and prevented for them by the current state of advanced liberal order. What the advanced liberal order has done is created a world in which the only way to live a life as a young person, particularly to operate in the contemporary economy, to get the supposed educational credentialing that you need to be a successful person in this economy. In the United States, taking on the level of debt you need to take on to get that educational credentialing. It means that family formation, having children, that's all delayed until you get to the point where it becomes almost impossible. So people put off having, getting married, having children, settling. So young people very much want these relationships. That desire, that basic desire of human beings has not gone away. It's just that the social material conditions are such that it's extremely difficult for them. And the broader social milieu is one that discourages them to think about that as a primary object or goal of their lives. Where, when my parents were young, 50, 60, 70 years ago, it was, of course, expected and a kind of almost a natural course of things that among the first thing you would do when you reach adulthood would be to find a spouse, to marry, and begin having children. So we have seen a fundamental shift. So I think a post-liberal world is one in which we're not going to simply go back to a default in which young people think automatically they will be married, but in which the political order begins to seek to provide the ways, supports, to compensate for aspects of the liberal order that have made it so difficult for young people to live that kind of life. And I think what we're going to see, I think coming out of the current administration, and if we see a continuation of the sort of the Trump political moment past this current term, we will see the rolling out of a lot of programs and a lot of initiatives that are going to be very pro-family in their nature, that are in fact going to signal strongly as a political social matter that as a matter of public policy, we regard family formation as centrally important to what it is to be a good American, to be a patriotic American, and will require the kind of comparable form of commitment and investment as the national commitment to military power has been in the United States for the last century. The question that's being asked increasingly in circles in Washington, D.C., who are concerned about these things, what is the point of having the most powerful military, power in the world? What is the point of that if, as a civilization, we're dying? If, as a civilization, we are not reproducing ourselves? We do not seek the continuation of this nation. And so the question I think that's really being asked in some of the corridors is what do we need to do almost as a kind of similar national commitment to what has been national defense, to shoring up and supporting the very core aspects of what it is to be a civilization. So I think that's really it's not going to be a return to the 1950s or the 1940s. It's going to be a moving forward into the 2030s and the 2040s. And I would say that's where we're going to see a kind of post-liberal order emerging.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. Let's see if this is how it turns out to be, and it certainly we wish everybody well in that. Uh, Now, you mentioned that this is a very profound question: that what's point in being such a large military force if at home we are not doing well in terms of population decrease and so forth, and everything else that becomes the result of it, i.e., the economic downturn and so forth. Now, if and we do know that Donald Trump he believes in descaling. I mean, he doesn't want American military bases everywhere. Couple that with the dying liberal order, and we also know that for last, I mean, the world after the Second World War and then the world after 1991, mostly it is the liberal hegemony that has ruled the world. Now, with the descaling policy and liberalism coming to its end, that is going to have a profound impact at the international level as well, because that power vacuum which can emerge, which is very likely to emerge, um, Soviets They are not in a great position to fill that. Liberalism going away. BRICS are more financial oriented people than political oriented, even though it's difficult to argue that you can have financial oriented without being political oriented. But I mean, the type of international political order making. So, with this kind of vacuum, I mean, this is going to be pretty much an unprecedented time because for as long back as we go in history, we've always seen one or two dominating powers, be in the form of the Greeks or the Romans or the Persians or the Muslims or the Western colonial empires, and then liberalism competed with communism for some time. Then communism went away, and then only liberalism. To quote Francis Fukuyama, the end of history is, believing that for the rest of the time liberalism is the only horse in the race. But obviously, that horse is now tiring. So what next? The huge vacuum which is now imminent. What in that?
Well, I actually don't. I don't think there's going to be. There will be maybe small, not small, but there will be pockets of in which the experience will be a vacuum. We've already talked a bit about Europe. I think maybe the your area of the Asia, the Southern Asian region will experience this to some extent. But I do think that really what we're going to see is the reversion to what's been far more the norm in the history of the world, which is a kind of regional powers and regional hegemons, and probably some degree of competition among regional hegemons for influence. But if we think about it, the example of global hegemon is rare. Maybe you mentioned Greece and Rome. Greece was not a global hegemon. It was a regional hegemon. It kind of took a bit of power when it defeated Persia, but its power didn't extend much beyond what we think of as the kind of traditional Greek. And even Rome, of course, Rome is maybe the best example we have of a global power, but that was really extended around the Mediterranean up into parts of northern Europe. And when it got up to that part, it began to weaken. So I think what we have gone through is a very unnatural time of a global hegemon. And you're right, of course, during the Cold War, it was competing powers. It was at least two, if not more, competing powers. So even then, it wasn't a single global hegemon. So what the end of history was a very brief hiatus between 1989 and maybe 2001 or 2016. The end of history lasted a very short time. And then history reasserted itself, and the reality of our globe reasserted itself, which is that nations and peoples have a strong interest in their particular area, and it's simply not possible for any one nation to exercise global hegemonic power, and nor do I think it's desirable, because the world is composed of many different cultures and many different traditions, and the idea that we were all going to simply be liberal and liberal democracies was an absurd proposal from the outset. When it was proposed in 1989, it was really a kind of a utopian imperialist vision that proved to be very short-lived. So, in fact, I think if you look at what Donald Trump has said as sometimes regarded as I think regarded by some as laughable or absurd ideas, that the United States should assert in some ways, exercise its influence over where Greenland, Canada, Panama Canal. That's a reversion to the kind of traditional American belief that the United States, should have a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. And this, of course, goes back to the Monroe Doctrine at the time of America's founding. And that, in other words, that there would be a refocusing on American influence where its sphere of influence rightly should be oriented. So far from representing merely a pulling back, as you described, kind of the bit, no longer having the bases everywhere. At the same time, it represents an assertion of regional influence that has always been a part of the kind of self-understanding of the United States. So I think these two things happening simultaneously is a kind of reversion to the norm rather than a kind of something that's new and has never been seen in the world before.
Well, I think the idea of regional hegemon, which quite rightly you mentioned that's what the history has always presented us with. But I believe in your part of the world, Professor, it's going to be much easier with the Monroe Doctrine you mentioned. No other military can go there and do any military exercises in your neighborhood. I'm just thinking about my neighborhood where we have
Yeah.
India and China and Russia not far from each other. Regional hegemon, well, which one?
Yeah.
And they all agreed.
So I do think, of course, I do think that there will be strategic partnerships. The United States will not withdraw from these kinds of strategic partnerships. I expect that. I anticipate that there will be a number of these partnerships that will be built out, not on the assumption that this or that nation is a member in good standing of that partnership because they are a liberal democracy. This has been the view of previous administrations, and a lot of what's being revealed in the USAID, that as part of development, the spending required nations to exhibit commitments to LGBTQ and transgender policies and so forth. In other words, that the extension of partnership was conditional on exemplifying that you were moving in the direction of being a liberal democracy. I think for the foreseeable future, and certainly under the current administration, it's going to be simply strategic partnership. Does it make sense for us to be a strategic partner with this particular nation, this particular region? And it's not going to be on the stipulation that you have to resemble whatever vision of liberal democracy was the expectation in previous administrations. So no, I don't think there's going to be a complete withdrawal. But I do agree with you that it's going to be a time of a certain amount of instability in what has been relatively settled relationships.
Right. USAID or USAID, as it is known in your part of the, it probably is USAID. I don't know why we call it USAID.
USA.
You mentioned that it's um, the programs it funds transgenderism, for example, LGBTQ, and other liberal values. In Pakistan, for example, $200 million have been pledged in past few years under the pretext of gender equality, which effectively is promoting transgenderism, which is profusely rejected by people of Pakistan in the elections, and the people who were pro transgenderism, they've faced very hard times in the at the local elections, and the people really stood up. But still, the feeling was that it's an imposition against the
Mm.
will of the people. And if Russia Today, the news outlet, if that is to be taken as the true news source, so far as this news is concerned, they've reported that back in 2001, 2002 sort of times, $50 million were given to Pakistani media. Now, I can't say whether this is the actual amount. Maybe it was more than that, maybe less than that. But one thing that we have seen that from that point onwards, there has been a dramatic shift in Pakistani media with promoting liberal values, making content which undermines the historical conservative values that are part of. If you look at the Asian culture, we are talking about thousands of years. If you look at the Islamic culture, we are talking about millennium and a half. And a clear war was declared on those values, and our media became much more westernized, liberal, and an entire generation was risen under that. And these youngsters, they are much different. But all of a sudden, if the plug is pulled, which I think it has now with the USA not giving all that money away, I think in many ways people of Pakistan can claim their culture back. But at the same time, it just goes to show, and I want your comment on this, that the whole idea of liberal values, one of the biggest slogans that it's all about living and letting other people live, maybe that is true on the individual level. But when it comes to taking an entire culture and imposing values on the culture that are not indigenous to the people at all. Well, it doesn't look like it's just living and letting other people live. Well, what's your take
Right.
on it?
Yeah. No, I think, of course, what's been revealed with this, with the funding, and of course, it's worth mentioning, it wasn't only funding that was being done overseas. There was quite a bit of funding that was finding its way into the United States media, United States organizations. So it was being directed domestically. What you're describing as having taken place in Pakistan and across the world, developing world certainly, was happening as well in the United States, which was the active effort to undermine those of more traditional religious beliefs. There was a absolutely targeted effort to undermine, to delegitimize the views of conservative or traditional Christians throughout the country. I mean, it's what we are really seeing is that from the very outset, liberalism understood itself to not merely be, as as one way of thinking of it, as merely a kind of live and let live. It was an active project seeking the transformation of the world so that every part of human life would accord with and conform to the liberal presuppositions that we began by discussing. And again, to go back to the example of John Stuart Mill made this quite clear in a book titled On Liberty. In the very first pages of a book titled On Liberty, Mill states that, well, for nations or cultures that are backwards, that do not yet have sufficient liberal commitments, it is justified that more progressed societies should force them through despotism to adopt forms of liberal belief. And once they have adopted those forms, then they can be allowed to be self determining entities. So from the very outset, it was an imperialist project both literally but of course, culturally, and the United States has been certainly a party to that imperialist project, not merely internationally, but domestically, in what I regard as really quite outrageous forms, but forms that have now, I think, been revealed, and I think disclose the extent to which these supposed laissez-faire claims have always been, kind of undergirded and shrouded by aggressively imperialist efforts.
That's very, very true. And I think some of the academic papers under the title of the liberal international order, the way in which the imposition of liberalism is identified in academia is that it's about it's a collective order, even though liberalism is about individualism, but it's a collectivist idea. I think John Mersheimer is quite open about that as well. That is a collective order. And the way in which it is created is that you have to have a necessary, inevitable war. And after the war, you start a huge nation building project and you recreate that country in the image of liberalism. Um, so eventually, if the entire world becomes liberal, that would probably be the end of the war. Um, I mean, that's an untested hypothesis because we don't have the entire world liberal, so we don't know what would that like. But I mean, even if it is to entertain hypothetically, the path to achieve that is through gore, violence, and broken hopes and shattered futures. Doesn't look like live and let live at all. it's, it's just no idea where those ideas came from.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
of course, that's the core of the argument of the book that brought me to some attention. Why liberalism failed is was to dispute and I hope refute the idea that that liberalism is a neutral, contentless set of procedures. And this is, of course, when I was in graduate school, as in some years ago. This was typically the way that faculty taught, and many authors attempted to persuade people that liberalism was the only viable and preferable order, was because it was the only order that was not based on some form of authority or some vision of the good, some telos or purpose or end. And I was always, even as a grad student, I was skeptical of that perspective. And I only became more skeptical over time as we reached the supposed end of history, and we saw very soon thereafter, the invasion of Iraq and efforts to astroturf liberal institutions on a non-liberal society. So I think, yeah, invoking the name of someone like John Mearsheimer, who's really, I think, thought a lot about this at the level of international relations, and I think has been an advocate of a much more realist, non-ideological understanding of great power relationships. I really do think we're entering a period where this basic view is going to predominate. We're going to go through a difficult transition, probably of you know my last book was called Regime Change, and I stand by the idea that America is undergoing a kind of regime change. It seems odd to say because we associate regime change with the idea of government being overthrown and tanks rolling into Baghdad, but in the Aristotelian sense of regime, as I've already mentioned, regime is the comprehensive way in which we organize the entire political, social, economic system. And so we are experiencing regime change without a change of the governing forms, but a change of the governing philosophy. And I think this is all for the good. I think, as I've argued in that book and elsewhere, uh, the United States has until recently taken a bad ideological turn, uh, and and I think this is a necessary correction.
But I had two questions in the end, and you answered just one of them. I was about to ask. You mentioned in one of your lectures that people say that when I say regime change, people believe that I by that I mean go and overthrow the government. No, I am much more radical than that. So to say it's not just the people who are
Yeah, as
ruling.
it turns out,
Yeah,
and we know this from recent history, it's not that difficult, at least when you have the military power of the United States, it's not that difficult to overturn a government, to go in and, with the right weaponry to destroy the existing government, and put a different government in place. That's relatively easy compared to the much more difficult task of changing the basic operating system of a political order. That's much more difficult. And in fact, it requires a much slower change of worldview that um, doesn't necessarily and rarely involves violence per se. It's a change in how we perceive the nature of reality. That's education. That's just reality speaking back to us. And I think that's really where we find ourselves now in the Western formerly liberal democracies of the world, is undergoing a kind of fundamental regime change that is much more radical.
it certainly is. Well, one last question, Professor. What are the new projects you are working on?
So I'm writing, I guess, volume 3 of which will be a shorter and I hope somewhat accessible book, to discuss many of the things we've been discussing right now. So what follows? What follows this waning of the liberal order of the last 50, 75 years? And it goes back to precisely what I was describing earlier, which is it rejects the idea that we need the public political order to advance progressivism and advance the causes of progressivism. But it also rejects the classical liberal idea that simply lifting the governing order will result in sort of the rebirth of healthy social life, and rather calls for a rethinking of what would be required for the political order to be supportive of the emergence of a healthy cultural forms in the Western world, many of which have been deformed and even destroyed by the experience of liberalism over the last century and a half. And so, starting with family life, community life, um, religious life, the kinds of the basic core aspects of our civilization that lead to human flourishing, they can't be thought simply to cure themselves. And so, what would it look like for a post-liberal political order to emerge and be positively contributing to the renewal of the good life for the citizens of our respective nations? So that's something of the project I'm working on. Title to be announced, but perhaps by the end of the year.
Well, in that case, I will certainly request you to be back on my
Very
podcast
good.
yet again. We're going to discuss that. And, I certainly hope that way in which you've been so insightful, very precise in this short amount of time, for the sake of the betterment of or development of the people everywhere, that people do take note of that. But in particular, uh, my part of the world in Pakistan, we have this liberal sentiment. Somehow, people, the disillusion that this is the only way of life which is going to make you successful. And
Mm.
from someone from the West who's been there, understand the system inside out, has done a great deal of study into it, to explain that why liberalism was always designed to fail is because of its core foundations that are not compatible with the human nature of coexisting and developing communities and so forth. Hopefully, people will take notice of that. I certainly thank you for your time. You've been amazing, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.